Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone P. Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Utahns react to last week's riot at the U.S. Capitol as Congress moves toward an historic second impeachment of President Trump. Lawmakers respond to the governor's budget and prepare for a unique legislative session. And state leaders implement new strategies to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Sonja Hutson, political reporter with KUER, Max Roth, anchor with Fox 13 News, and Frank Pignanelli, political commentator and lobbyist with Foxley and Pignanelli. Thank you all for being with us this evening. This is such an interesting time in politics, and there are just so many stories that are connected together. But I want to start with you, Max. A week and a half ago, I had a chance to even talk with you as the rioters are storming the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And since that time, a big event again with same kind of controversy with the impeachment proceedings. Talk about those impeachment proceedings in the House, really through the Utah lens, with how Utahns are seeing this activity.
Well, the impeachment charge, just one charge, incitement of insurrection, I think is the phrase, and that's a very serious crime that they're saying he committed, and that is because of not just the speech he gave to the crowd before they marched on the Hill, and his family spoke there too, and his lawyer prior to that, but also because he had signaled that would be a wild day through his Twitter account. January 6th would be a wild day in Washington, D.C., and asked people to come, and then from then until January 6th had consistently said that the election had been stolen, and that they would not have a country if they didn't, in his words, and pardon the language, but his words, fight like hell. And so that's where that charge comes from. The Utah delegation all voted against impeachment. We've heard specifically from John Curtis from the 3rd District and Blake Moore from the 1st. Curtis saying that he does think that Trump bears some responsibility for what happened last Wednesday, and he co-sponsored a censure motion. Blake Moore also saying that he was disturbed by those events. I don't think that he specifically said that the president bears some responsibility, but he's been pretty measured in his remarks. Our delegation hasn't been the fire breathers, but we haven't heard from Chris Stewart or Burgess Owens directly.
We're still waiting on them. Maybe it's worth getting into those words a little bit. Sonja, I want to read a quote from Congressman John Curtis, because it goes right to what Max was saying. I'm curious how you are hearing about this through our Utah community. Representative Curtis said, "I condemn the president's words and actions, which contributed to last week's violence, and encourage all Americans to similarly condemn. I vote no to rushing impeachment and politicizing what could have been a serious and thoughtful bipartisan review." This is what Max was talking about too, and this is the line that they're finding, is they're not condemning the actions, but talking about the process, the timeline itself.
I mean, I think it's a very typical response for a Utah Republican, right? Especially more moderate ones like John Curtis that really try to walk this line of, being a Republican, being supportive of the head of the Republican Party, who is President Trump, while also sticking to, not siding with him completely all the time. And so you have this walking this line of, yes, what happened was wrong, but I'm not going to go so far as to side with the Democrats to, move forward with this impeachment that I think is being rushed, and I don't like the process.
This is so interesting, Frank, because you are just so good on politics and you're connected also. This is a hard line. Congressman Curtis voted no on impeachment, but he's still getting death threats in the state.
He's still getting death threats. The problem is the impeachment, the second impeachment, has become politicized. I believe that had something like this happen at the state capitol, you would have had the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the two minority leaders in a joint press conference, because they immediately would have got together. That didn't happen in Washington. I don't know if those people ever talked to each other. Nancy Pelosi and Minority Leader McCarthy went their separate ways and started doing different things. So there was not that chance to get together and say, okay, how do we deal with this? Now, because yes, you have the insurrection, but at the end of the day, this is the issue that everyone, for all of us who love and adore our Constitution, it was that process that was happening. That was trying to be interfered with. And so you have to deal with that. So it's unfortunate that this has become politicized, because then you have our delegation having to vote with the Republicans, although some peeled off. It would have been better if they could have got together and said jointly, this is what we're doing, because now it's become politicized, which is then going to spill over, of course, next week into the Senate.
Yeah. So how does this play in Utah, Max?
Well,
because, go ahead, Sonja.
I just want to push back on that a little bit, because when is impeachment not politicized? I think that it's always a political process. It takes place in a very political body, that Congress, and I think it's always going to be politicized. Perhaps I think you can make the argument it's even more politicized now because of the climate that we find ourselves in, but I think it's always been politicized.
The last two impeachments, whether it was Clinton or Trump, you're right. But this was an attack on the Capitol. This wasn't a he said, she said. It was very clear what was happening. There was an opportunity, I believe, in those hours after the attack had happened, for both sides to say, how do we deal with it? Maybe it was an impeachment, maybe it was a censure motion, things like that. I didn't see any evidence of either party coming to say, how do we deal with this together? Well, then it became an impeachment process, which you're right, is now very political.
It was the most bipartisan impeachment in American history. Yet we've only had 4, but it was the most. Nixon, if he had reached that point, would have been the most. I think he, but still, I mean, to have the third in power in the Republican Party, Liz Cheney, on board with impeachment. Right. I mean, I don't know how do you, what more do you do? And especially when, as they were even giving their speeches, Minority Leader McCarthy said the president was responsible and needed to take responsibility for what happened on January 6th. And I think that, and so he's saying that and yet voting against impeachment with the process argument. But you know, there was clearly some condemnation from both party sides. I think the larger issue is that we have a country where millions of people are listening to and believing things that are just simply not true, that are easily disproven if you're willing to trust and believe that people in professional positions act out of goodwill.
Very interesting point, see, because that's clearly enough to mobilize a few groups of people.
It's scary. It's scary.
So to your point, so you had 10 Republicans who voted for the impeachment there in the House. And Sonja, talk about this piece here that both Max and Frank were talking about too, because some of even our delegation is hitting that second point and said, well, you know, this is like 48 hours to a vote. Maybe what we should have had is hearings and an investigation as opposed to just running right into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a valid argument that you can make. I think that obviously the clock is ticking a little bit because Trump doesn't have very long in office. And in fact, not to jump the gun talking about what's next, but the Senate trial is not going to start until after Biden is inaugurated and Trump is out of office. And so I think they may take some more time with that. But fair argument. I think that people on both sides of the aisle love to make the process argument. You know, think about the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett. Those were, you know, rushed through. You could say by some, you know, they were done very quickly, and I think probably both sides of the aisle are guilty of making that argument.
And you know, it's an indictment. That's what an impeachment is. It's an indictment. And when you think about the different kinds of crime, the Ukraine thing, you had a transcript, you had people who were testifying. That there were nuances to that required talking to people who were involved to get a real sense of what was happening. Now, whether this was a crime or not, leave that off the table for now. What they're saying was a crime is right there. So if there's something that obviously happens, guy robs a liquor store, he's on camera, he gets caught while he's running out with the loot, you charge him. You just take him and you indict him. There's not a whole lot of investigation that needs to happen. Well, everything that we're talking about is on camera and on social media. In this case, whether it's a crime or not, you know, if it is, indictment can be quick.
Not to mention the fact the vote comes from the very people who are in the room where the rioters were there. So
it's personal for them.
Yeah, very personal. Can I ask, because Sonja, let's get to what she's calling what's next. This hearing, this trial that's going to happen in the Senate, this is a precarious position for our two senators. All right, how are they going to walk this one? What are you seeing, Frank, with Mike Lee, Mitt Romney?
Well, we have a couple things going on. First of all, I think President Biden is going to say something because he has a whole agenda he wants to pass. And does he want half the time allotted to get his cabinet through and get all of the programs through, have it all chewed up by this trial? So you've got that issue. So what is going to happen is this. This happened in 2001. The last time it was a 50-50 split. Although you have the vice president who can make the difference, they'll come to a power sharing agreement in terms of committees and things like that because it is split. So they'll have to decide that process. While they're deciding that process, they're going to get input in from the president and others saying, what do we do about this trial? Do we do it now, or do we do it in 6 weeks? Or do we need to have a trial because the person's out of office, or do we want to do other, because we can have a separate vote or whether they not hold office? But what that does is that I would argue two things. A divided government actually sets it up very well for moderates because you don't have the votes, and even it's so tightly divided in the House, it actually gives a lot of power to the moderates, like a John Curtis or like a Mitt Romney to go work the other side. But at the end of the day, they're going to have to decide what do they do, because there was an attack. Let's take away the Capitol building. There was an attack on the Constitution. So there was an effort by some people to disrupt what was a constitutional process in the 12th Amendment. How do you deny that, and how do you deal with it? Just to blow it off is not going to be enough. So that's really where I think you see, where Mike Lee is a constitutional expert. How do you maneuver around that? Whereas I think you see Mitt Romney, who voted for impeachment, is probably in a better position to do that. Whereas I think Mike Lee will become, in many ways, the leader of the constitutional forces of how to do it. So I think both of our senators are well placed to have some influence in these deliberations.
So, Sonja, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think Mike Lee is definitely the one to watch. I would not be surprised if Mitt Romney voted to convict the president, given his very strong speeches on the Senate floor on the night of January 6th, given how he voted in the last impeachment. He was the sole Republican to vote to convict Trump on one of those articles of impeachment. But I think that Mike Lee, with his background as a constitutional attorney, is really interesting, right? And he's going to make a lot of arguments that I think in some ways kind of feel like a law school lecture, which is always really interesting to watch on the floor. And you kind of saw that on the night of January 6th as well. And so he's going to be the one to watch how he uses that background of being a constitutional attorney. He talks so much about his reverence for the Constitution and how important it is. And so I think that he's definitely going to be one to watch. And also you have the added layer of he's been a really, really close Trump ally for a few years now. And so it's going to be interesting to see how those forces play off each other.
I spend a lot of time listening to conservative radio and reading conservative blogs, and Mitt Romney is under attack constantly, and it is entirely about his positions in relation to the president. And it's interesting because we talk about him as a potential moderate with a lot of power. I mean, the moderation is in affect, it's in personality. He's very conservative. I mean, I don't know if there's any evidence that he's a moderate on anything other than the fact that he has taken positions against his party on this president. So, but it's he is it's very personal in these forums, and it's it's scary. It's this whole thing about this political atmosphere we have right now.
The other element that needs to be thrown out there is the pardon. Does the president pardon himself, which then becomes a process of litigation? Or, and as the Deseret News pointed out just a couple days ago, there is pressure on President Biden to pardon Trump. That way, like they did with Ford did with Nixon, to say, yes, you may not like it, but we have things to do. Let's move on. That's going to be up for discussion too.
We'll keep following this story even here on the Hinckley Report. I want to jump into it's a national issue, but with very local implications too, on the vaccine. Because I'm going to quote Frank Pignanelli. So on this very show, in the past, you said this is going to be the year of the politics of the vaccine. Is that playing out?
Absolutely. You see it on a national level and even a local level. You pick up the paper today and you have people screaming, yelling that they couldn't get through to the county health department. They're blaming Spencer Cox. Spencer Cox is doing a good job of trying to just unleash it, in my opinion, trying to figure out how it makes it all work. You've got politicians on both the legislature and the counties and the county health departments. And it's a rickety system right now, but they're doing their best to deal with it. And so it is going to be very political. Where it's going to get really political is when more and more people are starting trying to get it, and it looks like it's limited, and that's where there'd be a lot of frustration level. And when you got frustration with elected officials, it becomes political.
You know, I got a call in the morning from my father because he was trying to register himself and my mom for the vaccine,
right.
and couldn't get through on the website. And I have to say, from that perspective, you do wonder how it is that we've known this was coming for months. We have known for months that there was going to be a massive need to get vaccine to people, and still we're making decisions on the fly at the last minute, deciding, oh no, it's no longer teachers, or it is teachers. Oh, it's no longer essential workers. It's people over 75. Oh no, it's not 75. We're going to go back to 70. And then you get on a website that they could have had someone working on for 10 months almost, and it's not ready when they turn it on. That is a frustration.
Yeah, Sonja, tell us what you're hearing, because that's a very valid point. Not only all these changes, but even taking it out of the healthcare systems in the state, moving these to local health departments, even that caused websites crash. It's all the things that Max and Frank were just talking about. Talk about that for a moment, the implications.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's easy for us who, work in news, work in politics, to feel like, oh, I understand what's going on with the vaccine. I read about this every day. But when you think about people who do not work in news, who do not work in politics, they have to try to keep up with all these changes that the governor is making. And that's really difficult to do. And going back to, the websites crashing and things like that, I think we also need to look at this through a little bit of an equity lens also. If you have people who have bad internet access or don't have access to a computer at all, those people are going to have a harder time signing up. They're going to probably get the vaccine later. This is something that the state knows, particularly with older people. And I think they're setting up a kind of hotline so you can do it over the phone. But, to that point, why wasn't this done a really long time ago, especially when we knew that older people were going to be the ones to get it, relatively early?
Yeah.
Part of this is, it's something I've noticed, is that in America, when you look at our history, we're not good at top-down stuff. Because, you have the federalism, and of course you have the local governments, whether it's war or other crises. We're not good at the initial stages, but we catch up, we do better. I think that's what's going to happen. We'll figure this out. We did with the polio vaccine. In 4 or 5 months, it's going to work well.
Let's talk about. Go ahead, Sonja.
Yeah, and I mean, just to Spencer Cox's credit, I mean, he came into office and was like, all right, let's make some changes. He rolled out this executive order that, switched some things up, made the system a little more centralized locally within those local health departments rather than having vaccine distribution go through medical providers. He came out and he made some changes right off the bat.
And that was smart. I think going to the county health was smart because the hospitals, they're already burdened.
And also it means that...
their ICUs are at 94%.
Yeah, so why not go to county health?
And then it's clearly delineated too. I mean, someone from Davis County might go to the University Hospital, and then who's keeping track of who's been vaccinated? Yeah. But those health departments, they're county lines.
So credit to Spencer Cox for that.
Okay, so Spencer Cox has some more to do with this next legislative session, right? I want to talk about a couple of those pieces. Let's first talk about the session itself. Starts next week on Tuesday. Wow, Frank, everything seems to be different about the session. Wow, COVID's influence, but not just that, but the possibility of violence.
Possibility of violence, and usually people just throw things at lobbyists, but now apparently they take it to a new level. And yes, my job as a lobbyist has changed dramatically, and of course, it's also more importantly, the public input's changed dramatically because it's gone from what we were looking at, maybe kind of these hybrid models of communicating with lawmakers to everyone's locked up, at least for the first week and a half, maybe. No one, and I mean no one gets to the Capitol. But then it's still going to have a virtual sense because of the pandemic. And so, we've all been up the Capitol. I mean, it's a fun place to be during a session. There's a lot of pandemonium, but you're able to pull legislators off the floor, talk to you, get business done. Those days are gone for this session. It's very much a structured element of you talk to that legislator by phone or by Zoom and things like that, which still allows public access, but it does change the dynamics of groups of individuals, especially citizen activists, coming up, interacting with their legislators. And hopefully they find a way to make that happen.
Yes. Sonja, how are you looking at this session? As member of the media, trying to even get to these elected officials when probably not going to be allowed there for a while.
Yeah, we had a lot of really difficult discussions about how to cover this session, my colleague Emily and I, and there's a lot also to weigh about like your health and your safety and what you're able to do as a member of the media. And kind of where we landed was, let's cover as much as we can remotely, because what good does it do to our mission to inform the public if one of us gets sick covering something in person that we could have covered online, and then we can't do our jobs for a week or two all that well because we're sick and not feeling well. And so that was kind of the conversations that we were having. I think our plan also is still, if we're having trouble getting in contact with a lawmaker, which happens sometimes during the session, they're really, really busy. Then, you can kind of go up to the Hill and track them down and like, oh, I know you're going to be in this committee room at this time, so I'll try to talk to you then. But it's going to be really different. And I think that like health and safety has to come first, at least for me. And that's kind of how I'm approaching it.
Yeah, we're all, go ahead.
So one of the interesting questions among the political community is, once this big lockdown is lifted and the public's able to go interact a little bit, will there be an outbreak? Mm-hmm. And if there's an outbreak, what do they shorten the legislative session, or they just kind of muddle through? So that's one of the questions being asked.
Wow,
it's gonna be so interesting.
Wow. Well, and that's like that's the lawmaker side of what I was saying, right? Like if you have a big outbreak in the legislature and you have to like stop the session for a little bit, what good does that do? And so I'm obviously it's a little bit different, like being a legislative body versus being a reporter, but that's a consideration that you have to make as well.
I look forward to your podcast during the session, 45 Days on KUER, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be listening to how it goes and how you navigate that inside the Hill. Max, I want to talk about the budget for a second, because this is going to occupy the entire first week. Mm-hmm. The base budgets, everything else. The governor released his budget, but the legislature is already talking about this. Stuart Adams, this is the session of the tax reduction.
Yeah, and it's kind of shocking. And this is a place where Utah is kind of living in a different world than much of the rest of the country. I mean, we kind of do all the time anyway, but in this sense, with the Utah economy is doing pretty well, and so the budget is relatively flush, at least compared to other places. They have about $1 billion more in split fairly evenly between ongoing and part-time money that they could spend. Now they want to act like they have less in a way because they're worried that there's kind of a bubble there that's going to go away. But they're talking about spending more on education and also potentially borrowing more in bonding because it's so cheap to borrow money right now, especially with a state that has a high bond rating. And so it's but the question is, do you give a tax cut still at a time when there are a whole lot of needs? And even though Utah's economy is doing well, our unemployment rate is still about 1.5% worse than it was a year ago, and the people who are suffering are the people who could afford it the least, because the people who are losing their jobs are the people who weren't making much to begin with in retail, restaurant, hospitality, that kind of thing.
Talk about how the legislators are approaching this. As a former legislator also, as you look at this, there about $1 billion of one-time money on the table to be spent, but some legislators are looking at what Max called the bubbles, sort of this phantom amount of money that may exist in our economy because of the federal stimulus that came in.
There's a big concern about that. So first of all, they need to backfill some of the stuff they cut from that they did during the summer. So they're going to have to take some of that and then backfill that, then move forward and say, okay, we're worried about any ongoing funding ongoing programs because there may have been a bubble. The second thing is there's still a worry out there about a recession. If the national recession comes in, and so does that diminish revenues? But as you said, the Utah economy is doing so well. So legislators have got those dynamics. Then you have all the needs that are being pushed through because of the pandemic that there's not federal funding for, especially on the economic sector. So you have so you hear about all this money, and people say we could rush in and get our programs funded, but the legislators are trying to be conservative, both of trying to predict the future, 6 months out and a year out. So you can see all those different dynamics, and there will be a tax cut. It'll probably be an adjustment based upon the federal tax reform from a couple of years ago, but they want to be able to say that they have done that.
You know what they're calling it now? They're calling it, rather than the income tax, they're calling it the productivity tax. They're saying that you're taxing, the productivity of our workers, which is it's an interesting thing. They're changing the argument.
But the thing to watch for the budget is this: you had that Amendment G pass, which of course expanded the ability to use the income tax dollars
from education broader
for children. And it's interesting having some of these conservatives talk saying, well, we want to approach the holistic approach towards the education and care of children. So that's what they're trying to do, is say, we're going to pay for these programs through Medicaid or through different programs through the social services budget as part of the whole package. Right. It's an interesting concept, and it'll be fun to watch to see how they're able to accomplish this. And it has really changed the mindset of many legislators.
So, Sonja, with these legislators, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I had two things I wanted to talk about with Amendment G. So first of all, yes, definitely they had this whole conversation about let's help the child in a very holistic sense. But also, we can't forget that this was also a way to deal with tax reform after that package really kind of exploded last year, and lawmakers ended up repealing it to deal with what they're calling a revenue imbalance, where you have slowing growth of sales tax, but still income tax rising a lot, and the income tax goes to the education fund. And that's the simplest way I can think of to describe it. It's a very complex issue. But so this was kind of in a ways a replacement for that. And lawmakers will tell you that because they're able to take some of that education money and put it towards stuff that the sales tax would normally fund, that helps with that balance a little bit. And Spencer Cox said in a press conference recently that, this bought them a couple of years. And also, I talked to the Executive Appropriations Chair, Jerry Stevenson, last month, and he told me right now they're not going to be using that new mechanism. At least there's no plans to this session.
That's going to have to be the last comment. Can't wait to see what happens. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.